I want to proceed to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Andrew Schroeder is the Vice President of Research and Analysis for Direct Relief. He leads Direct Relief's work in data science, GIS mapping, epidemiology, and humanitarian technology. Dr. Schroeder told me that he did his undergraduate work at Rutgers, and he has a master's degree from the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Furthermore, he earned his doctorate in social and cultural analysis from New York University. His work has been published and featured in journals such as Science, The Lancet Digital Health, American Journal of Public Health, and in prominent newspapers, the New York Times and Washington Post and others. Dr. Schroeder is also the co-founder, along with colleagues at Harvard University, of Crisis Ready, a research and response analytics platform for the public good in disasters and health emergencies. Further, he co-founded COVID-19 Mobility Data Network, a global network of disease experts and public health experts dedicated to real-time digital epidemiology. There's more, but I think that's all we can put in our program right now, but his resume is huge. It's with great pleasure that we present Dr. Andrew Schroeder.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jim. And this is my second time speaking here. This is actually kind of amazing. First time was prior to the pandemic, which feels like about 25 years ago. And it was for a totally different set of projects around a different organization I co-founded called We Robotics. This is all about direct relief and about just thinking about the last like 8 or 10 years of the sort of co-evolution of crisis and data and the technologies that we use to analyze and communicate that data, which I gave the extraordinarily clunky title of Ubiquitous Real-Time Location Data, but which, the idea that we increasingly have this data at our fingertips for measuring events on the surface of the earth in real time at scale. And this is something which poses great opportunities, which I'll go into, but like huge challenges as well. And I'm going to do this as a tour, essentially, trying to convey this through stories about events that I've been involved in over the course of the last 8 to 10 years. Before I get into that, I want to just convey a little bit about direct relief and what is direct relief. What do we do? Really, there are 3 components to direct relief in our model of assistance. The principle is the delivery of medical aid. So the primary function of direct relief is to increase access to medicines and medical supplies for people that are living in poverty or crisis around the world. But that is sort of not the totality of what's required to respond to crisis. So we've increasingly become a large-scale granting organization. We supply financial resources to help with improvement of physical space, training, access to power, and other things that are required to deliver healthcare. And then increasingly, information and analysis itself as a form of aid. And ideally, the information and analysis drives the other 2 as well, but there is a kind of surplus to analytics, which allows us to engage our networks of partners in a way that makes that a material form of assistance in its own right. So I'm going to start my tour in California. Direct Relief is based in Santa Barbara, up the road. And the Thomas Fire, which at the time was the largest fire in the history of California. It's since been superseded many times by larger fires. But because it was in Santa Barbara, we were very directly involved, not only in kind of what we would normally do, which is distribute medical supplies, N95 masks and other things, but where we would have to sort of develop points of dispensing in the community itself for those things. And so, we had started doing this work, at the very beginning of the fire across the landscape of Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And, it was right about the exact same time that the Thomas Fire happened that I became aware of new data that was being published by what was then called Facebook about the location of the users of their application in real time. And, overlaid on remote sensing for the fire perimeter. And we could begin to look at the change in the density of the Facebook user base as the time proceeded, and where the evacuation orders changed, and where we saw increasing densities and decreasing densities at various points around the landscape of the fire. And it occurred to me almost as soon as I saw this that this is a fundamentally important input into our strategic planning for logistics, because it makes us think very carefully about, first of all, wanting to distribute where people are going towards, potentially not where they're leaving from, but also to carefully consider where they're leaving from and who may be left behind in those circumstances. And so the idea that we could begin modeling disaster response around behavior in near real time honestly never really, not that it never occurred to me, but we never had data really that could support understanding behavioral dynamics in real time. So what is Facebook human mobility data? It's actually changed somewhat since then, but I'm not going to go into the reasons why that changed because it gets into the details of technology companies. But it required an opt-in to location services, aggregated at 600 meters. So you'd see that tile sequence that I showed you, aggregated into 8-hour increments of time, measured against a 90-day pre-crisis baseline. So that allowed you to evaluate the crisis versus normal time. And it was only available through a nonprofit or research data agreement. So not for commercial purposes and not for government. And that'll become important later. But this is the kind of questions that we began to ask, I think, that were new with Facebook mobility data. Where do people evacuate? How would we learn this before? I mean, we would be told about evacuation orders by the sheriff or by other authorities. We had very little indication of the flow. How far do people go? Where do they go? How long do people stay away from home when they evacuate? These all have significant implications for the kind of resources that would be required to support their healthcare. As people spend longer times away from home, they're more likely to have medical crisis. And how do their patterns of behavior change relative to location, type of event, social vulnerability, and other factors, right? So people don't evacuate the same ways. They don't stay away the same ways. People that have mobility impairments are different from people that don't. Gender turns out to be a significant factor. Women and men, depending on the context and event, do not actually evacuate in exactly the same ways. And this is stuff that emerges from those data. Challenges that also clearly emerge from this data involve things that we will see over and over and over again in these stories. Bias. So bias here is not everyone has a Facebook account. It requires a smartphone. Not everyone has a smartphone. And as you go further out into the world, that becomes more of an issue. Representativeness. This is a sample of a sample of a sample. And so there are inherently some statistical representativeness issues that get better or worse where, depending on where you're looking, there's inherent uncertainty This requires a certain amount of modeling. So you're basing things on things that require demonstration of careful handling of uncertainty. There are access constraints. So in order to get the data, I mentioned like it's not available to everyone, requires data agreements. There's a legal process that has to be in place. You have to be able to handle large scale data flows. There's sort of big data sets and there's some methodology associated with this. So, and the capacity for doing that is unevenly distributed around the world. So all of this became clear in the Thomas Fire and is more clear the farther out into the world you go. So my next stop on our tour is in Mozambique, and cyclones Idai and Kenneth, where we began to consider what I call minimum viable modeling and the concept of translational readiness. So what do we have to be ready for in order to translate data into insight? Just a little background for those of people that don't date their lives by major world disasters. Cyclones Idai and Kenneth took place in 2019 across southern Africa, principally these countries, killed a large number of people and affected even more, but was mostly known for a large-scale cholera outbreak that took place as a result of it. So cholera happens when sanitation infrastructure is badly impaired. It's an intestinal disorder that can lead to serious illness or death. If untreated, it's relatively easy to treat. But when we began thinking about the needs for data here, we sort of go through the ontology of humanitarian assistance. So there's a remote sensing component to this around flood modeling. There's population density. In this case, comes from the high resolution settlement layer data set, which uses machine learning on top of census data and satellite imagery to disaggregate population down to 20-meter grid cells. Studies on cholera prevalence. So where is cholera actually an underlying problem so that we could feed this into models? The network infrastructure. So one of the things that made it difficult to use the mobility in here is that you can see the network was actually highly unevenly distributed and impaired. And then the data on actual caseloads came from the public system and is actually recorded in a totally different way and is actually janky. So you have to figure out how to pull all of these things together into a way that will make sense for planning and for understanding where the cases are likely to go in a way that parallels what I was saying before about evacuation. So we put a model together. I worked with people at Harvard School of Public Health to build a model for this, to think about the vaccination campaign that would be required in this case, we didn't have this ready for Idai, but Kenneth came afterwards and we were able to actually put this together for Kenneth. And one of the things that became sort of quite important to understand about that is that we had to make judgments about which data sets were actually going to be valuable here and how to inject that into the decision process of the Ministry of Health, which has sovereign authority for running the vaccination program. So, the translational dynamic here involved not just doing the analysis, but making sure that you're able to link together a number of different actors, in this case, the health cluster, which is the UN system, research teams that can sort of input into that, the data providers such as Facebook or the public health system or the remote sensing providers that were providing imagery, the government of Mozambique, and other NGOs. We published this in Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine, so if you want to go read about it, you can. And the lesson being that the readiness to translate is as important as the data and the analysis itself. In many ways, the whole ballgame comes down to this, is on, do you have the right networks in place to be able to manage it? So I was actually the same year that I was here last, was 2019. And in the same year, just right after that, although technically by December, it was spreading pretty far and wide, was the pandemic. And the principal work of direct relief in this case, and just to go back to the kind of triangle was to protect community health workers. So, we were supporting logistics across a global network that involved primary health centers in the United States, all the way to community health organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. We began our response in China, supporting the health system in Wuhan. And so have a fairly large scale logistics operation. And so this was sort of the time of the floods of public health information. Everyone became an epidemiologist. And so we were sort of focused on coordinating these large scale health data flows, many of which had a spatial component. But in particular, the thing that was really novel, I think, as a spatial problem, at least that I became involved in, was this problem of social distancing. So, we all remember this, right? But it's in some ways hard to remember back to how new this problem was. This had actually not been tried at scale. And so when the pandemic first happened, the imperative was to do what was called flattening the curve, right? So make sure that you could reduce the case numbers so that hospitals and other parts of the health system were not overwhelmed, which would give you long enough to be able to develop countermeasures. And when policymakers implemented this, they had really never implemented this at scale before. So everything was brand new. And the same people that I had been doing the work in Mozambique and the data from the Thomas Fire, the folks from Facebook, we got together right at the very beginning of the pandemic and put this together for science around, how you could actually sort of take that same data that we were using for evacuation analysis and apply it to COVID-19 and this sort of inverted evacuation problem, right? We want to know not where people disperse to. We want to know, are you staying home? Are you actually adhering to public health guidelines? Still a spatial problem, but just a different kind of one and used very similar kind of data. This became the golden age of mobility data. I know that probably not everyone experienced the pandemic this way, but I did. Google published data sets from Google Maps for the first time on the changes in population at the county level. Apple, it was unheard of for Apple, of all companies, to release data, but they released a data set on the distribution of people in movement in cities. SafeGraph aggregates advertising text, so when your mobile phone moves and you could determine, the signal for similar kind of population density change. Cubic, similar. I won't go into the details behind it. All these dashboards came out, very confusing, lots of dashboards. And public policymakers were confused as hell about this. They would look at these dashboards and I need to make decisions very, very fast involving millions of people. How do I actually use these dashboards? It was a confusing time for the public health leadership of the country. This is an Esri one, using telemetry data from Mapbox to begin then associating the mobility signal with population dynamics to understand some of the demographic factors that were associated with movement. And this problem of translating data into action for the public system is what led to the COVID-19 Mobility Data Network, because very early on, we realized that this was not going to be manageable. These data sets were not going to be injectable into the decision process unless we deliberately put networks together that would be trusted and able to influence public decisions. I personally worked with the data science team for the state of California, for the governor's office, but we had people working with the New York City Department of Health, and a range of others, all the way out to different states in India, to Botswana, to Australia, and others, all of which had the same problem. This was what was amazing about the pandemic, actually, not to sound too excited about it, but it was really kind of an incredible time for putting networks like this together. And so, what people wanted to see was, how did these vary? The rate of staying home and going out vary. This is aggregated up to the county level in California. And this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services in California, putting my graphs up for the briefings where we were communicating whether or not their policy signals were being adhered to, became like this daily grind of getting these metrics into the hands of public policymakers, telling them what it meant, what it didn't meant, what is the uncertainty factor, how does this relate to the other stuff. And that work is really at the heart, I think, of making the data effectively used in this case, a humanitarian health crisis. Other examples, had people embedded in Santa Clara, looking at regional travel networks and commuting patterns and how that related to disease networks. In Salt Lake City, Utah, Seattle, Washington, working with the Institute of Disease Modeling, where the particular question was around land use and the variance in sort of areas of the city, types of land use, and whether areas of the city made a difference to mobility patterns. That had implications for where you actually would be expecting changes in exposure and contact rates relative to these transport patterns. In New York, where we did a fairly intensive study on interborough transport and contact rate as proxied by testing of pregnant women, and where we were getting early insight into how difficult it was for people that were living in the outer boroughs to socially distance because of job structures and other things. And so this early insight was then helped to really was foundational for thinking later about a lot of the social policy changes which were to come. And again, you can read about all this stuff online. This one was in the Lancet, and we put together then a sort of set of thinking about how you sort of turn this around into international crisis response and sort of bring a lot of these, disaster questions back in towards the end of the pandemic, and systematize this into, I think, a fairly simple framework of what is required to make this work. And I think of this was sort of foundational to what we now call crisis ready, which is a readiness framework. You really need three things. So all of the examples so far have involved data readiness. So you've got to have data pipelines, agreements, you've got to have a structure in place to make this work. Methods readiness, so that we have tested methodology, models, things that have passed peer review. We ideally don't want to have to innovate all of this in the middle of crisis, at least not every time. And then translational readiness, or the networks that are needed to be able to understand and utilize and integrate into decision structures. So, I could go into all kinds of details about the readiness framework. I just want to call attention to one thing about this. I mean, I mentioned a lot of this around social media data. I get really invested in this mobility question just because everything in the world involves mobility. And it became sort of interesting to me as to why we were using social media so often, when in fact, the real useful data source would actually be mobile networks themselves, actually the signal off of the towers. And it turns out this is really hard to do, and there is no model for accessing this in an emergency. There's lots of pilot projects you can see. There's maybe one project in Haiti through Flowminder where there is actually a kind of history of this, but there really is an absence in our global data landscape around how you authorize emergency use of the data that we all create through our mobile phones. We actually have the ability to do this safely, to do this privately, to do all kinds of appropriate analysis, but it's nationally regulated. This is one of the things that Facebook has up on this, because Facebook's a single company with global reach, so you don't actually have to go through national regulators. But this has actually been solved for remote sensing in some important ways. There was a similar problem in the early 2000s around lack of access to satellite imagery, which resulted in the creation of the International Space Charter, which is why when we now get disasters, you see satellite imagery that is produced by companies like Maxar and Planet and others that can distribute this. There is no parallel to this for mobility data, and I think that should change. Anyway, just to remind you of all the same challenges again, I just want to make sure that we keep in mind that these factors all applied in the pandemic. They apply constantly. We have to keep them in mind in everything that we do. I just want to make sure we're not running out of time too bad because I have a whole bunch of stuff. Changing the topic a little bit, but keeping in the same genre. Actually, I thought we were in 2022 really nearing the end of the crisis. And then, because the pandemic really started to wane a little bit, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and it made my life really complicated again, amongst many others. So the same kind of problems maintained, though, that we had a large-scale displacement phenomenon as the result of conflict. This is Kyiv, and it resulted in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Over 8 million people displaced across the border and across the continent, and other places besides. We did a whole lot of other stuff for distributing aid in Ukraine, including over $1 billion worth of assistance. It's been the largest response in our history as direct relief. And we applied a lot of the same techniques in response to the refugee crisis that I mentioned earlier, in response to the wildfires and COVID-19 and the floods in Mozambique, to be able to understand what was the kind of scope of this 8 million people. Like, how did we understand that? The image in black on the left is very soon after the attack on Kyiv first happened, and where we began sort of through the mobility data monitoring the Polish border, and sort of could see the direction of change for population flowing through the evacuation points on the border, all these checkpoints that were maintained, and then the dispersal of that population across Poland. Because the distinctness of the refugee data here was that we had actually really good data from the border census that was tracked through the government, so you could know how many people crossed the border. But what happened to them afterwards was actually quite hard to figure out. Which cities were they going in? Where are the greatest concentrations? What are the demographics of the people and the places where they're settling? And all of those things are what make the greatest difference to the resource problem. How do we actually determine what they need? One of the ways you can start to realize the kind of to model where this is happening was to add information to the mobility. So again, through the Facebook platform, we were able to look at what's called the social connectedness index, or the likelihood that someone from one part of the world is connected to people in another part of the world. And what you find time and again in displacement crises, and particularly in refugee crises, is that the most likely determinant of where people are going to go is whether they know people in the place that they're going to go. In the case of the Ukrainians, they speak Ukrainian, and so it's much more likely that you will actually receive services and be able to rebuild social networks if you're going to places where other Ukrainians reside. So when you sort of combine the mobility data, which provides you this sort of real-time signal of where people are literally traveling, with the social connectedness signal, which tells you where they're most likely to go, you get actually a pretty high-resolution picture of the distribution of these people across the continent. The best work on this was done through the European Commission and the International Organization for Migration, which really modeled this at scale every day for the continent and looked at these sort of dispersion patterns. You can really see this density through northwestern Poland into eastern Germany, the Czech Republic. There are lots of Ukrainian communities through here, and the social network data gives you a pretty useful insight into this. And this is also then similarly connected back to the mobility data, which shows you very similar patterns as you evolve over time. So this is actually based entirely on mobility, but repeats the social connectedness pattern. So you actually see virtually the same thing. And for us, actually, this allowed us to invest financial resources in a program called Health for Ukraine, which was worked out through a medical card provider in Poland so that we could distribute cards for people for refugees to purchase goods and services at pharmacies distributed around Poland that they would otherwise not receive through the government healthcare system. So being able to then combine the analysis of dispersion with a payment mechanism that could let them seek care at pharmacies. I want to take this in a slightly different direction and look at a different set of technologies in kind of the recent cases of Afghanistan and now Gaza. So far, we've been talking about big data sources from third-party providers like Facebook. There's a different project I've been involved with for some time that we won this award for few years ago from the Gates Foundation that focuses on a new technology called geomessaging. So the ability to target messaging using geography. So essentially enabling communication based on where you are, not who you are. And to apply this to how we actually coordinate in real time in humanitarian crisis. So basically, it's an app that's combined with a kind of GIS so that you can link messaging in a multi-directional fashion back and forth. So we could identify particular areas on a map and communicate with people that are in that map. So the map itself becomes a form of communication. This is a very simple principle that as you layer it up and scale it becomes really complicated. You can get incredible things done with it. And the app is on the App Store and the Play Store called Direct Relief Data Volunteer. And I started using this in response to the takeover of Afghanistan, which just wanted to remind people because we tend to memory hold these things as to this is sort of what happened in 2021 that led towards the takeover of Afghanistan. Just the first part of this came for me in July when I started getting these sort of urgent messages from friends of mine who were on the Afghan girls robotics team. This was well in advance of when people were saying that there was going to be a big problem in Afghanistan. They were like, I know you think there's not going to be a big problem. I can tell you, I live in Afghanistan. There's a big problem. You need to get me out of here. So we began coordinating their exit. So we got the first part of the team out in July and then began getting their families out, some of whom had problems with not having passports and other kinds of things that made travel difficult. They were also sort of all different ages, old, young, and as we got them sort of coordinated, they were mostly from Herat, which you can see on the map. And, by the time they got right to the outskirts of Kabul, the Taliban took over the city. And so we began having to try to evacuate them from Kabul. I don't know if you remember all these scenes of people like crowding the roadways and holding on to the airplane tires as the planes were taking off. It was a terrible time. And it was around the same time as well that I became familiar with a group called the Asian University for Women, which is a university that's based in Chattogram, Bangladesh, that educates women from all over Asia, which had a large number of students that were based in Afghanistan on a US State Department funded program that also needed to get out of Afghanistan. This is not what I do. I actually do not facilitate evacuations, but we had some technology and I just tend to say yes to these things. So anyway, this is what it looked like. And we got this app into the hands of the families of the robotics team early on. So they were at this, we got them to a safe house on the outskirts of the airport. They were not clear on what to do. Should they approach the airport? Should they not? This is when they were actually sitting in a shelter that was sort of off to the side of the approach road to the airport. They were concerned about not being able to get through. So we were mapping out their position. They were communicating back to us through the app about sort of their own concerns and fears about what was happening. And so those messages were all sort of being relayed. We sort of were sort of doing simple mapping. This actually was something where you can draw on the map, and then this transmits to them as an augmented reality layer that they could hold up their phone and sort of see the route actually on the phone. So you could sort of point it around and they could understand the direction that they were supposed to go. It's not that far, but it was a very dense and confusing time. And so then sort of dialogue with them as far as coordination happened. They were going back and forth and back and forth. They made this sort of secondary return to the Abbey Gate, which was the British-held gate that was sort of on the southeastern side of the airport. And this was where the explosion took place. And when the explosion took place was right when I had these students on buses that were sort of right kind of near the airport as well, which I'll go into sort of how they sort of use this. But the families was a very ad hoc process getting them on board, but really quickly decided this isn't going to translate. Our translational readiness is going to fail if we don't quickly systematize the process. And so when we started to onboard hundreds of students, we had to kind of put this together into a framework that would actually allow them to just follow instructions and become part of a spatial network. And so this spatial network was distributed all over the city of Kabul. This is what it looked like when we were first sort of putting this network together. We were sort of lighting up their phones all over the city, and we could see that this was a big logistics problem. All of these sort of points are the messaging points, and the orange points are the locations for where the students were. And so we began to sort of create a ad hoc spatial coordination network in real time during the evacuation process from Kabul, using QR codes to just quickly download apps and things like this. And at the very same time, there's all these people from the open source intelligence community that began doing things like mapping out the checkpoints. So these are all, this was a feature service that was created that was real-time updating the location of the checkpoints for the Taliban across the city. And so those orange points are where the students were, and the blue dots are where the checkpoints were. And so the game, as it were, was to make sure that you could coordinate to the buses without actually passing through the checkpoints so that you would not actually get stopped by the Taliban, and do this in a way that was quick and safe. And it worked. At the same time, we sort of put in other big data signals. So this is Data Miner, which is a service that pulls from social media and other sources to give you spatial targeting of alerting. The most important thing from Data Miner, this was, Twitter messages and things like this, was the tail numbers of the planes. So suddenly they were actually recording the tail number of every plane that was taking off and landing at the airport. So suddenly we could actually ad hoc create a kind of air traffic control network that was associated with the distribution of the students. And because the timing was everything for how you actually get them to the airport. I mentioned that, this is where the students were. This is the airport you can see on the satellite image. All these points were students that were on the buses. They got stuck really at this point, which is the South Gate entrance to the airport, where we kind of went back and forth on this when the explosion happened at the South Gate, which killed, I think, 17 soldiers and other people. And where at that point, the gate was shut down, security closed, the airport was shut down. And then I kind of almost gave up hope at that point because I'm like, there's no way they're going to reopen this airport. And so I had been awake for about 2.5 weeks at this point. And so I finally went to sleep, and I was woken up in the middle of the night by the president of the university then telling me about how they had actually reapproached the airport, but they were lost and they could not find the right gate. And it turns out that they were actually on the wrong side of the airport. And they were like, you have to help us kind of navigate Kabul. And I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We created this ad hoc navigation network in the middle of the night. I won't play her voice. And sort of put this rerouting exercise into place quickly, got them back to the airport, sort of did the exact same exercise before with augmented reality. You know, the students were getting sick and tired of being on these buses. It was a very dangerous situation. It represents the discussion. And then they finally were able to get through. I actually was sort of working with the people on both sides of the gate. And then we could at one point I get this call, I had to share this feature service with the State Department. And they would, at one point I was like not paying attention. And I get this call and he says, I think I want to check if there's a problem with your map because I think there's actually dots on the other side of the checkpoint now. And so they finally were able to get through. They had negotiated to get access to the airport and were able to get out on the second to last plane out of Kabul. And it's a good thing that it was the second to last plane because then it turns out that as students will sometimes do, two of them actually fell asleep at the airport because they were exhausted from being on here. And so I get this third call from the university president and said, I have another location problem for you. I need to find these students. And I was like, how am I going to find these students? They're like, it could be anywhere in the world. And it turns out that they were smart enough to leave their phones on. And so we quickly geolocated them to these air bases in Kuwait and was able to actually direct the people from the State Department to the exact room that they were in the airbase, and they found them. And you can read about this in the Times of London and the New York Times. Afterwards, they went on to be enrolled in schools all over the country. They formed their own school at Fort McCoy, actually. They were like, we're bored being in this base, so we actually formed a school and began teaching other people in the base about things that they thought were interesting. And ultimately, we got about 600 of these women out of the country and enrolled both in the United States and at the campus in Chattogram. And currently, the same process is ongoing in Gaza, where I didn't want to show the individual locations, but the heat map is the locations of students, and the background is the building damage that has been incurred in Gaza since the beginning of the ground campaign in October. And so, the need for all of these same processes in real time, the access to real-time spatial information becomes one of these really life-saving humanitarian technologies in and of itself. I want to end with the story from Libya around geo-artificial intelligence and near real-time remote damage assessment, which I think is one of the most exciting applications of this stuff. You may remember that there was a tropical storm named Daniel that was in the Mediterranean last year. It came ashore and caused a dam break, and there was catastrophic flooding in the city of Derna, which is a coastal city in Libya. So the entire downtown area was destroyed. This is what the post-disaster imagery in Derna looked like. And one of the things I think is just totally remarkable about the technology that's at our fingertips today in GIS and spatial analysis is things like automatic image segmentation, so that we could begin automatically classifying the damage to buildings to understand, to pull vectors out of here to compare to pre and post imagery. This is based on the segment anything model from Meta. There's other ways to do this. Google publishes a model called SKAI, SKAI, which is machine learning for damage assessment. And based on that, we take training data and open source satellite imagery and run a model on the building footprints in the area. I aggregate this to sort of smooth out some of the error and then compare that to the health infrastructure in the area so that we can do rapid identification of the most likely damaged health facilities and begin within days well before we have teams on the ground to begin identifying where what's the scale of impact on hospitals and health centers, and how do we begin to put together plans for what a resource allocation system would look like in places like Derna, Libya afterwards. And that, I think, gets back to this sort of where I started with our kind of what does direct relief do to be able to identify where we can most rapidly get access to the right medical aid. How do we sort of direct resources to places where we might need to get resources, but which medical aid is not necessarily the most appropriate, and where information itself saves lives. And that's about it.
Thank you, Andrew, for what you presented us today. I have two questions for you. The first is Rutgers College, Livingston, or Cook?
No, New Brunswick.
Well, I went to Livingston, graduated in '93. So it's nice to see another.
College.
Exciting to see another Scarlet Knight here. So my principal question is, many of these case studies involve places where there was still civic government. But as you got further and more closer to the present, you have more and more places where there's been a breakdown in governance practices. And so I'm thinking about the contemporary crisis in Haiti and how something like what you're trying to accomplish here earlier seemed to require an active, engaged, functioning civil government. But you think about Afghanistan, you think about Derna, and now you think about Haiti, where that's just not the case anymore. What are the challenges that come that even this kind of technology can't fully address?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's a key problem. I mean, like, and it's the headline problem of the most serious crises around the world is the confluence of conflict, breakdown in governance, and underlying weakness of systems. And Haiti fits all of those categories. I will say that, like, it doesn't mean that the data goes away, actually. So, I mean, the Digicel network in Haiti is still functioning. It doesn't actually depend on the government system in order to function. So, there is analysis being generated. I think the question becomes, like, to your point, how do you actually create the translational system for making that actually useful? I would not say that's an easy problem. There's a set of very specific, like, evacuation problems that are people are attempting to sort of stay out of the way of conflict. So you can correlate, like, the proximity of conflict reports to your location. So we probably support in Port-au-Prince about 35 different locations, different health facilities and other sort of points of care. They're not necessarily leaving, but they need to be able to adjust their behavior based on the proximity of conflict. And then looking at the mobility signal in Haiti that, sort of gives you a sense of shift in neighborhood concentration. And then as people leave Port-au-Prince, where you're then getting secondary care needs across the island, where you're sort of moving to places where it's not as crazy as Port-au-Prince at the moment. So, like, all of those dynamics actually, I think, can actually sort of work regardless of the sort of nature of the governance breakdown. If you have the technical layers that are still there and the ability to engage with people that you have a longstanding relationship with, so there is the ability to kind of communicate those instructions, like with the students in Afghanistan. It's no substitute for functional governance, though. So, like, everything I just described will not bring back functional governance to Haiti. So that's something that requires, like, longstanding social trust and resources and the ability to sort of empower local actors that feel a stake in the future of their country. And that's a much longer term problem than we can resolve through any of this. But, I think the interesting thing here is that there are emergency circumstances that actually, even in what you're seeing now, don't just disintegrate. Like, they do still exist.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really intriguing. And I would like to thank you for what you're doing. It's, humanitarian effort goes really into those details that we're not aware of, those sleepless nights that you have gone through. So thank you so much. About 2 weeks ago, I think the center featured a speaker from Walmart who is director of public affairs, and he talked about how Walmart has been engaging in spatial analysis and data collection in order to fill into their logistics, right? So when there is any emergency, any crisis, they will be able to actually supply their stores with necessary merchandise to help people in need. So, but in your presentation, something sticks out to me as a nonprofit. So what's your take on future maybe collaboration with retailers or businesses that like Walmart, that they are for profit, but they are also engaged in initiatives like those?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, we work with a large number of private sector actors. Our sort of logistics backbone, actually, at least in terms of package shipping, is through FedEx. So, we've learned a lot over the years from how FedEx manages their own understanding change in networks and efficiencies of transport through them. The way that we've thought about this, we're occupying a particular position in the logistics network, I think, to where we're handing off to other actors usually. So direct relief, say, is able to, in most of international crises, we're trying to get access to the entry points into the country and then to transfer to other actors that are responsible for last mile logistics. The strength of direct relief is not to guide the local logistics of our partners, mostly because that would sort of put us in the position of running local logistics networks, which is actually not what we want to do. The sort of goal in those cases ought to be to hand off to local actors that can do that work. So from my point of view, the much more profound question would not be just what direct relief can learn from Walmart, but what can Walmart teach to last mile logistics experts around the world? If we have a situation where sort of significant amounts of logistics intelligence are sort of concentrated into organizations like Walmart, it would be actually quite interesting to be able to understand the means by which that knowledge and maybe those systems could actually inform, trucking networks and other, actors in many other parts of the world. In most cases, our principle is to not substitute for local infrastructure. So, when we responded to the cyclones that I described earlier, the on the ground logistics for that, I mean, we were getting things into South Africa and then trucking networks through South Africa, which actually have very sophisticated systems of their own, and they don't actually need my help, were able to manage ground logistics going into most of the areas of need in Mozambique. And I think that's actually the much more appropriate way to do international humanitarian assistance. There's a piece that is required from us to manage the logistics to get access to resources at a point where we can then effectively hand off to local actors and they can do their job. So that would be my sort of pitch to Walmart, to say it'd be great to actually create systems that could boost the capacity of local actors through the world to do all of those kinds of logistics systems much better.
With your Afghanistan example, I was thinking about the risks of tracking all these vulnerable people in this horrible situation. And was there any concern about data getting compromised, or were you just assuming that the bad actors weren't capable of hacking your system or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, the system was private by design in the sense that there was no personal information collected other than their location, which is a lot of personal information, but it doesn't contain anything else, like their name, nothing. It's a tagging system to identify them as part of the group. And there's a secure QR code, essentially, that they have to be able to, there's a specific code that they would have to enter to be able to access the network. So I wasn't that concerned with the network being compromised. I also wasn't that concerned with with hacking like the digital signal, by the Taliban, which I didn't actually believe had the capacity to do that. I mean, it's a little different in Gaza in the sense that I'm like 100% sure that the network is compromised. There's nothing I can do about it. Like the Israelis have the best signals intelligence in the world in many ways, and I'm not going to be able to, I'm not interested in countermeasures on that. I'm interested in the incentives to allow people to transit freely when they have been verified and allowed to transit. And so in that case, actually, it's actually more important to share the information openly so that we identify that, these people are not targets. They're people that have been authorized to travel, and that the greater problem is that there'll be a mistake and that they will be accidentally targeted. The political problem is far beyond that, and the kind of negotiation around travel is sort of ongoing and very arduous. But I would say it's sort of the opposite problem, that I'd rather be open in that case, because I don't want them to mistakenly believe that we're trying to mask their locations because there's some nefarious purpose. It's the opposite.
Andrew, I have a question for you online. Andrew, this way.
Sure.
We have a couple of dozen, not questions, but attendees online. And one of them is Dr. Ashish Satpathy, who is Professor of Information Systems and GIS at Arizona State. His question has to do with some of the things that you have touched upon. Can you speak to us a tad more about some of the factors in the model, such as logistical complexity, infrastructure damage, and resource limitations on the ground? How are the models, particularly their need to perform in real time in these times of distress? How are some of these issues intersecting with that real-time need?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I wouldn't say that all of that is actually model output. But there's sources for a number of those factors. So, the movement signal can, in many cases, especially when it's derived from telemetry. So when I was describing, say, data from Mapbox, Mapbox is designed from people that are accessing maps for the sake of navigation, and then that feeds into not only like a population estimate, it feeds into a transport network accessibility estimate. So as you see changes in sort of rates of utilization of different parts of the transport infrastructure in the road infrastructure, we can then relate, where we see obstacles from the sort of changing telemetry information with changes in where people are actually moving and their routing around obstacles and things like this. So, that combines with remote sensing, which sort of gives you confidence in what the telemetry is telling you. So there's sort of a related signal through telemetry and remote sensing that can give you a pretty good sense of the level of impact on a road environment, basically, and the capacity that people can move around it. The modeling of where, health facilities are, say, in that, I wouldn't call it a model at the moment, actually. It's mostly sort of descriptive analysis. So it's looking at basically locations, catchment areas, and then change in population access to facilities. So, it's where you can sort of define the number of people that are affected, be serviced by a particular infrastructure point that are able to access or not able to access that, and then how that relates to your ability to actually get access through goods transport to that point. But I don't think that's maybe it's a model, but it's not really a very complex statistical model. I think of that particular one as descriptive analysis, but open to ideas about better logistical modeling that would help to make that a more sophisticated process.
Thank you.